All right, let's jump right into this explainer on how Australia's World Cup run ended in a totally heartbreaking, dramatically tense penalty shootout loss to Egypt. We're stepping into a match that literally had absolutely everything you'd expect from top-tier international football. We're talking the sheer exhaustion of a grinding 120 minutes, some deeply baffling managerial decisions, and a high-pressure shootout that ultimately exposed some massive, foundational weaknesses for the Aussies. We're going to break down exactly what went wrong for the Socceroos here, and we'll be focusing heavily on how their tactical setup invited relentless pressure onto a vulnerable defense, how their goalkeeping strategy completely crumbled under the global spotlight, and honestly, the shocking lack of grit from their veteran players when it mattered most.
To really wrap our heads around this collapse, we have to start with the harsh reality check delivered by sports pundits right after the match. Their verdict was brutal. They said Australia is, quote, nowhere near good enough with the football. Now look, commentators were quick to praise Australia's undeniable fighting spirit. They are a super proud sporting nation, and they fought fiercely right to the bitter end of extra time. But as the analysts pointed out, when you step onto the immense stage of international elimination football, raw emotion and national pride just aren't enough. You've got to have the tactical and technical quality to back it up. And, offensively, Australia's limitations were glaringly obvious. They simply lacked the polish to control the game.
So the big question driving this entire explainer is, who actually takes responsibility when the pressure is at its absolute highest? Because this isn't just a story about technical skill. It's a story about mentality and nerve. What we saw in the dying moments of this critical game was a truly baffling lack of grit and leadership from Australia's most experienced veterans. When the game was squarely on the line, the players you would fully expect to stand tall, demand the ball, and lead by example, they were nowhere to be found. They shrank into the background, leaving this tremendous, completely unfair burden squarely on the shoulders of their exhausted defense and their absolute youngest players.
Section 1. A high-stakes stalemate.
Let's set the stage by looking at the match itself. This was a gritty, exhausting battle that limped to a 1-1 draw after a full 120 minutes. The stats perfectly illustrate how much Australia struggled here. Egypt controlled huge, sweeping chunks of the possession. But for Australia, the story was much bleaker. They couldn't even generate a goal from their own offensive play. Seriously, their only score of the entire match came courtesy of an Egyptian own goal. They were relying heavily on chaotic set pieces and long balls because they just didn't have the creative spark to break down Egypt's defense. And here is why that is so crucial. This total offensive vacuum meant that relentless, suffocating pressure was dumped entirely onto the Australian defense and their goalkeeper to hold the line shift after shift. It was basically a recipe for a structural collapse.
Section 2. The Galaxy Brain Manager.
The narrative shifts now from the pitch to the sidelines. Let's dig into the pattern of bizarre, over-tinkered decisions made by Australian manager Tony Popovic. Pundits openly called these Galaxy Brain decisions. You know, those frustrating moments where a coach tries so hard to outsmart the opposition that they just end up outsmarting themselves. Popovic was heavily criticized for this throughout the tournament. First, in a must-win game against the US, he inexplicably benched two of his most dangerous attackers, Aaron Kunda and Volpato. Then, against Egypt, right when you absolutely need your best players on the field to break open a tied game, he pulls his top attackers around the 70th minute. By doing that, he basically invited the Egyptian team to attack his already exhausted defense without any fear of a counterattack. And then, he makes the most debated tactical decision of the entire tournament.
Section 3. The Goalkeeper Swap.
This is the moment that's going to be debated in Australian football for years, the ultimate roll of the dice. On one hand, you have Patrick Beach. He's a 22-year-old rising star, out there in goal for 120 grueling minutes. He's totally in the flow of the game. His adrenaline is pumping, he's tracking the ball perfectly, and he literally just made a massive, crucial save late in the match to even get Australia to the shootout. Plus, he's taller with a longer wingspan. And then, on the other hand, you have Maty Ryan, a 34-year-old veteran. But here's the massive catch. He's been sitting completely cold on the bench for an hour and a half. Yet Popovic mandates swapping the red-hot 22-year-old for the freezing cold 34-year-old right before the kicks.
The logic here was supposed to be a psychological masterstroke. Bring on the intimidating veteran just for the shootout to get in the shooters' heads. But pundits pointed out a glaring physical flaw. Ryan is actually shorter than Beach, so he didn't have that imposing wingspan advantage. And way more importantly, Ryan was visibly off the pace. A goalie at this level needs 10 to 15 minutes of live action to get their reflexes firing to track an international-level strike. Ryan had 0 minutes. As a direct result, he didn't even get close to 3 of the 4 Egyptian penalties. He was diving a fraction of a second too late. This grand tactical masterstroke ended up being a disastrous miscalculation.
Section 4. Missing grit under pressure. The goalie swap wasn't the only disaster in that shootout. When we look at who actually stepped up to take the penalties, it reveals a truly shocking evaporation of grit from Australia's veteran players. It's almost unbelievable, but 2 of the first 4 penalty takers were center backs. Think about that. In a do-or-die shootout, you need players whose whole career is built around striking the football under pressure. Harry Sutar is a fantastic, physically dominant defender, but he isn't a pure technical striker of a stationary ball. Yet, he stepped up and blazed the first penalty wildly over the bar. Then, an 18-year-old defender, Lucas Harrington, stepped up and hit the crossbar. The immense burden of scoring fell directly onto the defense.
Which brings us to the screaming question that had pundits utterly furious. Where were the veteran attackers? Where were the experienced attacking midfielders and forwards? In a defining moment that requires absolute ice in your veins, you do not send your defensive backline to do an attacker's job. Analysts were demanding to know why the seasoned defensive players, the guys literally paid to score goals, shrank from the moment entirely instead of stepping up and demanding the ball.
And that harsh reality brings us to this number, 18. That is the age of Lucas Harrington. Picture this, the agonizingly long, lonely walk from the center circle to the penalty spot, the deafening roar of the crowd, the weight of a whole nation watching. That is the environment this kid was left totally isolated in. Now, Harrington is a highly touted prospect playing in MLS and linked with Barcelona. He clearly has world-class potential.
But as one analyst perfectly summed up the frustration, what happened to the men on that team that should have stood up? You absolutely do not put that kind of sheer, unadulterated pressure on an 18-year-old in a World Cup elimination game when you have veterans on the pitch. The teenager showed incredible character by saying, "I'll take one." But the older professionals showed a catastrophic lack of grit by hiding in the background. Someone with a decade of experience should have grabbed that ball, told the kid he'd done a magnificent job surviving 120 minutes, and absorbed that pressure themselves. Instead, they let a teenager take the fall.
Section 5. Mo Salah seals the deal.
Now, transitioning over to the Egyptian side, they had their own veteran narrative playing out under that exact same pressure, and it gives us a razor-sharp contrast to the Australian side. Let's talk about Mo Salah. He did not have a perfect game. Pundits noticed that Father Time has definitely started to slow down his pace. He was criticized for walking around the pitch for the first 100 minutes, waiting for the ball instead of sprinting into space like he used to. He was really leaning on his superstar legacy. But unlike the Australian veterans who faded, Salah finally came alive in the last 15 minutes of extra time, buzzing around and creating dangerous situations.
And then, when the stadium lights were at their absolute brightest in the shootout, Salah didn't hide. He didn't pass the buck to a younger teammate. He confidently stepped up and delivered the final blow with an ice-cold, unbelievably cheeky Panenka penalty, floating the ball right down the dead center of the goal. It was a moment of supreme, almost arrogant confidence that secured Egypt's first knockout stage win since 1934. He might not have his old blazing speed, but he definitely still has the nerve.
So as Egypt celebrates this massive survival, we have to ask a final, daunting question. Will Salah's fading speed and habit of drifting out of games end up costing them when they face the tactical brilliance of Argentina? Look, Argentina's defense will ruthlessly punish a slow jog. Egypt barely survived Australia's defensively heavy setup today, and they are going to need the absolute best, most dynamic version of Mo Salah if they want this historic run to keep going. Because as we just saw, mentality and pure grit clearly matter just as much as talent on the world stage.